Arizona Territory, 1883. The sun beat down hard over the town of Denton Creek, its dry heat pressing against the dusty, clapboard buildings like a wall. It was just past noon when the stagecoach rattled into the square, wheels grinding over gravel and boots crunching as folks turned to look. That was when she stepped down, or tried to. Her knees buckled before her boots hit the ground. She collapsed right there in the square, face pale and skirt stained with trail dust, her bonnet slipping sideways as her bag tumbled from her hand. Yate Walker had been loading a sack of flour onto his buckboard when he saw her fall. He did not hesitate. Dropping the sack where it stood, he crossed the street in long strides, boots kicking up dust as he knelt beside her. "Miss," he said, brushing her hair gently back from her face. "Can you hear me?" She moaned softly, her lips cracked from thirst, her dress clinging to her like it had not been washed in days. An older woman stepped forward from the general store. "Mail order bride," she murmured. "She came in on the last train from Kansas City, I heard." Poor girl must have traveled clear across the country. Yate lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. "I'm taking her to my place," he said, voice low but certain. "She needs water, rest, and not a dozen eyes staring at her." Nobody argued. Folks in Denton Creek knew Yate Walker, widower, rancher, and man of few words. He had lived out on the edge of town for nearly 10 years, raising cattle and keeping to himself. He carried her to his wagon as if she were made of glass. The ride to his ranch was quiet, save for the creak of the wheels and the soft rasp of her breathing. The cabin came into view past the cottonwoods, simple, solid, with a porch wrapped around the front and smoke curling from the chimney. He carried her inside, laid her gently on the bed, and fetched a basin of water. Her eyes fluttered open as he dabbed her forehead. "Where am I?" "Safe," he said. "You fainted in town. I brought you here to rest." She tried to sit up, but he stopped her with a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "You are not going anywhere until you can stand without falling." Her gaze traveled around the cabin, then back to him. "Who are you?" "Yate Walker. I own this ranch." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "My name is Beulah Fields. I was supposed to meet a man here. His name was Troy Hammond. We wrote letters. He promised. I was supposed to marry him." Yate's jaw tightened. He had heard that name before. Troy Hammond had left town 2 weeks ago, chasing gold rumors up near Tombstone. "He is not here anymore," Yates said. "And if he left you waiting, he is not worth your breath." Beulah turned her face away, blinking fast. "I sold everything to come here." Yates stood, poured her a glass of water, and handed it to her. "You are not alone." "Not anymore." She sipped slowly, the water settling her. Her hands were delicate, but her eyes, even red with travel and grief, held something steady. She had not come here for adventure. She had come for survival. He watched her for a long moment. "You can stay here. I have space. You need time to get your strength back. I do not want charity." "It is not charity. It is help. That is different." Beulah blinked at him, then gave a slight nod. Over the next few days, she moved from the bed to the chair by the window. She would sit quietly, mending a seam or staring out across the hills. Yate brought her coffee in the mornings and stew in the evenings. He never asked for anything, never pried. But he was there. When she started walking again, he showed her how to gather eggs. When she burned her hand on the stove, he wrapped it gently, his fingers brushing hers. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with orange and gold, she stood beside him on the porch. "You live alone?" she asked. "I have for a while." "No children?" He hesitated. "I had a wife. She passed 5 years ago. We never had any." Beulah looked down. "I was never married. I was raised by my aunt. She died last winter. I did not have anyone left. That is why I answered the ad." Yate nodded. "Sometimes folks forget how loud silence can be." She glanced at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You do not talk much," she said. "I talk when I have something to say." She smiled, just a little. "That is fair." He looked at her, at the way the wind caught her hair, the way her eyes held a quiet kind of strength. She had been knocked down, and she had not stayed there. "You can stay as long as you need," he said. "I do not want to be a burden." You are not. The moments stretched between them, the kind that did not need to be filled with words. That night, after she went to bed, Yate sat on the porch, staring out at the stars. Something had shifted. He had picked her up because it was the right thing to do. But now he found himself listening for her footsteps in the morning, waiting for her voice. He had not expected that. Inside, Beulah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She had come here with nothing. But now she had a roof, food, a man who looked at her like she mattered. Not because of a letter. Not because she was promised. Just because she was there. She did not know what would come next. But for the first time since the train ride, she felt like she could breathe again. Beulah pulled the last thread through the ripped sleeve of Yate's work shirt and tied it off carefully. The stitching wasn't perfect, but it'd hold. She folded the fabric neatly and set it on the table, then stood and stretched. The muscles in her back ached from the unfamiliar labor, but she found herself grateful for it. Doing something useful steadied her. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing dry leaves across the porch in soft rustles. She stepped out, holding her shawl tight around her shoulders. Yate was in the yard, kneeling beside a trough, scrubbing mud from a wagon wheel. His sleeves were pushed up, forearms streaked with dirt and water. She watched him a moment before walking down the steps. "Do you always do your own repairs?" she asked, her voice light, but her curiosity real. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "If I waited for someone else, nothing would get done. Would you show me how?" She nodded at the wheel. "I don't know much about anything mechanical, but I'd like to." He studied her expression before responding. "All right, but if your hands get caught between the spokes, you won't have anyone to blame but yourself. I'll take the risk." He motioned her closer and handed her the brush. "Start with the axle joint. That's where grit likes to settle." She crouched beside him, copying the motion. The bristles scraped against the iron, and the wind shifted her hair across her cheek. Yate didn't brush it away, but he noticed. After a few minutes, she asked, "Did your wife like living out here?" He paused, not startled, just thoughtful. She liked the quiet. Said it gave her space to think. Beulah nodded slowly. "I think I understand that." They worked in silence after that, the kind that didn't press or pull. When the wheel was clean, Yate stood and stretched out a hand to help her up. She took it and he didn't let go right away. "There's a market in town tomorrow," he said. "If you want, we could ride in together. I need to trade for seed." "I'd like that. I could use a few things myself if I can find someone who'll take a mended handkerchief as payment. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Heller. She keeps extra linens and trades for small sewing. I'll introduce you." Beulah smiled, a real one this time, faint but warm. "Thank you." The next morning, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that promised nothing but wind. They rode out in his wagon, the road winding past brittle grass and low hills. Beulah sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, bonnet tied tight beneath her chin to keep it from flying off. "I've never been to a western market," she said. "Back home we had stalls lined up along the river. Women would argue over peaches and the men would slip off to play cards. Here they argue over nails and flour." Yate glanced at her. "You'll find fewer peaches, but the cards are the same." When they reached town, he helped her down as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She didn't pull away. Together they walked among the wagons and canvas tents, past barrels of dried beans and baskets of tobacco leaves. She stopped at a table of cloth scraps and asked the price of a faded cotton square. The seller looked her over, then pointed to her mended gloves. "That stitching yours?" the woman asked. "Yes." "Take the cloth. And if you can fix the hem on my apron, I've got a jar of plum preserves in it for you." Beulah's fingers curled around the fabric. "That's fair." Yate waited while she bartered, his arms crossed, face unreadable. But when she returned with the jar tucked under her arm, he gave a short nod. "You'll do fine here," he said. Later, as they loaded the wagon, she said, "You didn't have to bring me. You could have left me at the cabin." "I didn't want to." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Because I like having you there." Beulah didn't answer right away. Her heart beat faster than it should have, and her cheeks felt warm despite the wind. "All right," she said softly. "Then I'll stay." Neither of them said more on the ride back, but something had shifted between them. Not sudden, not loud, but sure. Back at the cabin, she made coffee while he unloaded the seed sacks. When he stepped inside, the scent met him first bitter and rich, like memory. She handed him a cup. "I found the tin in your cupboard." He took it without a word, but his fingers brushed hers. This time she didn't look away. Outside, the wind whistled across the land. Inside, the quiet was different than before. It wasn't empty anymore. The first frost came early that year. It crept in one morning without warning, silvering the split rail fence and stiffening the grass underfoot. Beulah stood at the window in her shawl, watching Yate cross the yard with a handful of kindling. His breath fogged in front of him, and his coat was buttoned to the throat. He stepped inside, shutting the door against the wind. "Ground's too hard to dig the new post holes," he said, setting the wood beside the stove. "We could patch the holes with stones," Beulah said, brushing a curl behind her ear. "At least until the ground softens again." Yate turned to her, something new in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement. "That might work." She moved to the hearth and knelt to stir the coals. "Back in Missouri, we used to press salt into the cracks of the foundation come winter. Kept the dam from rising." He poured water into the kettle and set it on the stovetop. "You miss it." "Some things," she said, "but not the way it made me feel small." He didn't reply, only handed her a tin cup once the water warmed. She wrapped her fingers around it, letting the heat settle into her. Later that morning, she followed him to the barn. The horses were restless, their breath rising in plumes, hooves clattering on the frozen ground. She held the bridle while he checked the hooves, her fingers brushing the mare's neck in slow, steady circles. Yate stood and dusted his hands. "She's favoring the back left. Might be a stonecod. I'll hold her steady." He crouched again, and she watched him work, noting the care in his movements. When he stood, he looked at her sidelong. "You take to this easier than most. I didn't expect it, but I like the rhythm of it. Things make sense out here." They walked back to the house in silence, the cold sharp against their cheeks. Inside, she warmed her hands by the stove while he cleaned his tools. "Do you ever think of leaving?" she asked quietly. "No," he said, not looking up. "This land raised me after I buried everything else. I owe it." She nodded, her gaze falling to the woven rug beneath her feet. "I used to dream about cities. Lamps and windows, carriages, music from the street. But now I think I was just trying to outrun the quiet." He glanced at her, then set the last tool aside. "You don't seem like you're running anymore." She met his eyes. "I'm not." That evening, she brought in a bundle of dried sage she'd found hanging in the back pantry. She crumbled a bit into the stew, the scent earthy and strong. Yate lifted his spoon, took a bite, and paused. "You cooked before?" he asked. "Only when I wanted to be left alone in the kitchen." He chuckled once, low in his chest. "Well, it worked." They ate in companionable silence, the fire popping in the hearth. When she stood to clear the bowls, Yate reached out and stopped her hand. "You don't have to earn your place here, Beulah." She held his gaze, her eyes steady. "I want to." He didn't let go, his callous fingers warm against hers. "Then we'll build something together." Outside, the wind howled through the hills. Inside, the quiet had changed shape. It no longer pressed against them, it wrapped around them like a space carved out of the world, solid and warm. After supper, he carried in another armful of wood. She was by the window again, watching the moon rise over the far ridge. He closed the door behind him and stood beside her. "First snow'll come soon," he said. "I'm not afraid of it." She reached for his hand, curled her fingers around his. He gripped hers in return, neither of them speaking. They didn't need to. In the hush of that room, against the cold pressing in from every side, they stood together in the kind of silence that meant something had begun. The wind had calmed by the time morning light filtered through the chinks in the shutters, breaking across the cabin floor in thin gold lines. Beulah set her feet down carefully, the floorboards cool beneath her soles, and reached for her wool skirt, which still held the faint scent of wood smoke from the night before. She dressed without hurry, her thoughts steady, anchored to the rhythm of the place. Yate was already outside, the door left ajar just enough for cold air to slip through. She stepped out after lacing her boots, pulling her shawl tighter as she followed the sound of hooves shifting in the paddock. He was near the fence, examining the latch on the gate. The sky behind him was a pale stretch of blue-gray, thin clouds gathered high and reluctant to break. "I could help mend that with leather if you've any spare," she said, her breath rising in faint wisps. He turned slightly, one gloved hand still on the worn hinge. "There's a strip in the lean-to bottom shelf by the door. Might be stiff with age. I've worked with worse." Yate didn't smile, but something eased in his shoulders. She crossed to the lean-to, found the leather, and brought it back with a small tin of oil. Kneeling beside the gate, she began threading the strip through the iron loop, her fingers sure despite the chill. "You ever think about putting up a second paddock?" she asked, not looking up. "Thought about it a few winters back. Never had reason enough to. I could ask around town for lumber when I go next week," she said. "Might be someone with extra boards. Or even a cart they'd part with." Yate watched her hands work. "You planning to keep going into town alone? If you're planting next week, you'll need both hands here." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Just don't trade for another jar of those preserves. I'm still trying to finish the first one." Beulah glanced up at him, her expression dry. "That was a fair deal. I didn't say it wasn't." They finished the repair together, the gate holding tighter now, the latch snug in its place. Yate led the horses out to graze near the scrub where the grass still held beneath the frost. Beulah followed him halfway before pausing near the low rise that overlooked the rest of the property. From there, the land rolled out in long, quiet waves, fence lines threading toward the hills and the shed roofs catching light. "You built all this?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Started with the cabin. Barn came later. Shed was last. Took time." She folded her arms. "You ever think you'd share it again?" He looked at her, the wind tugging gently at the edge of her shawl. "No. But I'm not sorry I am." They walked back side by side, not touching but close enough that the space between them held weight. That evening, as she kneaded dough for biscuits, Yates sat by the fire with a piece of rawhide stretched across his lap, carving a new strap for the saddle. The knife moved in slow, deliberate strokes, the scrape of blade to leather a steady sound beneath the crackle of the fire. Beulah wiped her hands on a cloth and turned toward him. "You think the cattle will hold through winter? They've weathered worse. I've set aside feed. Just need to keep the cords dry. I can sew sacks if we need more storage." He didn't look up. "You don't have to do all this." "I know. I want to." His hands paused. "That makes a difference." Later, after supper, she stood near the window, her reflection faint against the dark outside. The moon had risen, pale and round above the ridge. She felt his presence behind her before she heard his steps. "You ever afraid it won't last?" she asked without turning. "I used to be. And now I'm learning to trust what stays." She slowly faced him. "I didn't come here expecting to be needed. I didn't expect to need anyone again." They stood close now, the air between them quiet and warm. He reached for her hand, folding it gently into his. She didn't pull away. "Beulah," he said, her name slow and sure. "I'm not going anywhere, Yate," she answered, her voice steady. Outside, the wind had stilled entirely. Inside, the silence held. Not empty. Full. The thought came slowly that spring, softening the earth in patches and setting streams to murmuring again under the cottonwoods. The air still held a bite, but green had begun to press up through the brown and the robins had returned. Beulah knelt in the garden plot behind the cabin, her skirts gathered above her boots and her fingers sunk deep into the loosened soil. She paused only to rub at her lower back, then went on turning the earth with steady, purposeful movements. Yate stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a worn cloth. He watched her a moment, then crossed the yard with measured steps. "You ever plant beans before?" he asked. She sat back on her heels. "Not in Arizona soil. Though my aunt taught me to mark the rows with string and trust the sun more than the calendar." He handed her a bundle of twine from his coat pocket. "Then let's trust the sun." They worked side by side, marking straight rows, pressing seed into the warm dirt. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to point out where the ground held moisture or where the incline would shed too much rain. She listened without interrupting, her hands moving as if she'd been doing this for years. When they finished, she brushed her palms together and stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "It's a start. It'll feed us come summer." She looked toward the hills, where the last of the snow lingered in the shadows. "I never thought I'd be building something with a man I didn't know a season ago. You know me now." "I do," she said, "and I trust you." He looked at her then, full and without hesitation. "I want this to be your home, Beulah, not just a place you landed." "It already is," she said, her voice low, sure. "Because you're in it." They didn't go back inside right away. Instead, they walked the edge of the field, where the fence line met the brush. A pair of quail darted from the undergrowth, scattering into the grass. Beulah reached for his hand, and he took it without a word. That night they sat outside after supper, the table cleared, the sky wide and clear above them. She brought out the quilt she'd been piecing together since winter, and he helped her stretch it across the porch rail to catch the fading light. "You stitched our names into the corner," he said, tracing the letters with one calloused finger. "I wanted to mark the beginning of something," she replied. He looked at her, his voice low. "Then let's call it what it is." She leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "Tell me." "I love you," he said, "and I want you to be my wife." The quiet that followed wasn't uncertain. It was full, brimming. She turned to face him, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said, "I want that. All of it." They married the following Sunday, beneath the cottonwoods by the creek where the water ran clear and cold. The preacher from town came out in a borrowed buggy, and Mrs. Heller brought a basket of cornbread and apple preserves. A few neighbors gathered by the fence, not many but enough to witness something true. Beulah wore a simple dress with lace cuffs she'd sewn herself. Yate shaved clean that morning and wore his father's watch, the one he'd kept wrapped in oilcloth for years. When he took her hands in his, he didn't stumble or hesitate. "I will carry this life with you," he said, voice unwavering. "And I will shape it beside you," she answered. They kissed once, soft and certain, and the breeze carried the scent of juniper through the trees. That evening they sat together on the porch, the sun low behind the hills. Chickens clucked softly in the coop, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to the dusk. Inside, her sewing lay folded on the table beside the tin of tea he'd bought for her in town. His boots were by the door. Her shawl hung beside his coat. Two lives no longer separate. Over the months that followed, the beans came up strong. She planted squash and onions. He added a second paddock, and they repaired the roof before the monsoons. She read to him by lamplight when the storms came through, and he built her a rocker for the porch. By winter's return, the cabin was warm and full, not just with firelight, but with laughter, with work shared and rest earned, with quiet moments that needed no explanation. And when he reached for her in the stillness of night, she reached back without fear. Their love wasn't hurried. It had been planted like seed, tended through frost and drought, and come up strong. And it stayed.